collective called The Cabinet. He works primarily with text, video, and photography. And okay.
Hello, good evening. Yeah, first of all, thank you for finding the time to join us in the discussion. I'd also like to thank Merv Espina and Rica Estrada. Merv has always been supportive of the cabinet, and yeah, it's 2012, no, when we first met. And yeah, he's always been supportive of projects like this. Um, I'd like to thank Rika, no, for accommodating us here. Apparently, there's an added reflexive and ironic layer to the talk since it's now situated in the CCP itself. Other than um, the talk centers on um, partly on the history of CCP. Um, the second part of the paper will tackle my great grandfather's Comedia, 1930s Comedia Principe Baldovino, and I'll be taking cues from his text uh, to to kind of find a way around again notions of complicity and um, yeah, notions of complicity in the context of collaboration between cultural producer and state. My great grandfather's Comedia was adapted by national artist Rolando Tino in 1971 to inaugurate the CCP Little Theater. And that was several months after his death. He wasn't aware of the existence of the CCP, and he's also not in the invite. This in any paraphernalia. He wasn't credited since I suppose the um, Tino and the rest of the staff, the production staff, just assumed that since it's comedia, no, since it's a folk form, that it's public domain. But several I was able to confirm, no, in several writings by Trin Fernandez, uh, since she was the one who acquired the writings shortly after Piedad's death. Doreen Fernandez was working on her MA thesis back then in Ateneo under the mentorship of Nicanor Chongson. Yeah, so there. So yeah, so it's a little I could do, to kind of reinscribe him, uh, reinscribe him back in the CCP. He never set foot here. Uh, so it's kind of my little tribute to my great grandfather. So yeah, again, thank you for accommodating this project. Um, what else? Um, Towards the end of the paper, I'd be repeating. I'd be using the phrase "lend me your softness" um, for a number of times. Just to, it's actually a prompt uh, from curator Renan Lauraan for uh, for um, for works that he commissioned for myself and eight other artists for debatable screenings. Curated series of global contemporary video in 2016, and that's when the germinal notes for this full-blown research began. So there. Um, may mga sections din sa paper na to, no, that already appeared in High Chair 22. For that particular issue, they solicited responses from writers uh, regarding itong revivalist machinery, no, ng mga Marcos, at yung muntik na pagkapanalo ni Bongbong. Uh, Tsaka may initial din na discussion, mas hilaw na discussion na nag-start sa Los Baños, organized by Magpies, spearheaded by Shona Cledera. So there. Simulan ko na siguro. Feel free to interrupt me in case you'd like to clarify something or ask anything. um, so, okay, so the Marcos family. I suppose is one of the commissioned paintings during their term, wherein they're depicted, no, as a kind of royal family. Or so in this picture, this was taken in the late 60s. So this is Enrique Jimeno Piedad. He's my great grandfather. He's the author of the Comedia. He authored one version of the Comedia Principe Baldovino. Beside him is my mother, and behind them is an assemblage sculpture uh, made by Piedad as well. Other than writing and directing comedias in the Calamianes Islands, he also uh, created makeshift props for the productions. The CCP logo, and ito yung picture ng CCP Little Theater. And then, yung curtain ng CCP Little Theater na dinisenyo ni Shabet. It was woven in Kyoto. National artist for theater and film, Rolando Tino. This is national artist Daisy Avellana, who played the role of Reina Arminda in Principe Baldovino. These are scenes from Principe Baldovino. This one is the final scene. Okay, it's a description ng CCP, especially the ones na medyo fancy yung description or very patronizing, no? Were mostly lifted from De La Torre's CCP Crystal Years and History of the CCP by Eliana Maramag. These two CCP publications were part of the PR machinery of the Marcos, of the First Lady's um, term. Ito yung iba pang mga parang propaganda materials, no, na in-author din ni Eliana Maramag. This would be referenced later on in the essay. Sa mga large-scale installations ni Renew sa Ilocos, commissioned by Governor Amy Marcos. And this is Magdalena Gamaba awardee, Gamaba Award, Gawad Manlilikha ng Bayan awardee Magdalena Gamayo, who made the Inabel, the death shroud of Marcos when he was buried in Libingan ng mga Bayani. Okay, sige, simulan ko nang basahin yung papel. They went into my closets looking for skeletons, but thank God, all they found were shoes, beautiful shoes. Imelda Marcos was quoted as saying what was supposedly a comic remark at the opening of the Marikina Shoe Museum in 2001. The irony is hard to miss, and even more blatant is the unwitting and chilling allusion to the enforced disappearances throughout the martial law years, the obliterated, now traceless bodies. In one recent interview, Senator Marcos asked, hinting at the alleged golden era of infrastructure that his father's loyalists claim to be unprecedented in the history of our country. Will I say sorry for the thousands and thousands of kilometers of roads that were built? What am I to say sorry about? In the rampant insistence of Marcos supporters that one of the darkest periods in our history has in fact been the country's golden age, and in such denial of the crimes and atrocities perpetrated by the Marcos regime, the disappeared are doubly erased. There was no martial law memorial to remind the people of the atrocities of martial law. Dr. Prospero de Vera III lamented. What the people see now are the gains of martial law, like infrastructure projects, roads, and bridges built during martial law years. The state-sponsored infrastructure that then functioned in part to euphemize and anesthetize the fascist rule of the Marcoses now facilitate in the production of oblivion, as supporters vehemently and repeatedly enumerate the names of edifices and other structures that for them are Marcos credentials and testaments to the nation's progress at that time. The specialty hospitals, road networks and bridges, the LRT, and the buildings that comprise the CCP complex, to name several. There are no other monuments for the disappeared, save for one at the Baclaran Church, and there are not even markers for the graves of those whose bodies have never been found. But while the grand buildings, such as the CCP, cited as monuments to the greatness of the Marcoses and their reign, continue to obfuscate the victims and the crimes the Marcoses have committed, one can resist the labor of effacement by rereading these structures from the glorious past, as constituted instead of traces of the catastrophic event that is a martial law. Both Ferdinand Marcos and Imelda Marcos felt the need to fabricate the country's quote-unquote deep structures that would endure the passage of time on the top of roads and bridges, buildings and houses that are mere surface structures. This is from Ferdinand Marcos' interview himself. Marcos has acknowledged that no Taj Mahal, no Angkor Wat, no Great Wall stands with us to remind the colonial intruder of his insolence in affecting to civilize us in exchange for exploitation. Conversely, the same structures that the conjugal dictatorship erected in the absence of glorious pre-colonial monuments should stand with us now to remind us of the exploitation and damage wrought upon the country in the name of the new society. As the realization of the First Lady's vision and grandiose dream and her first major building project, the CCP is probably foremost in the Marcos couple's exercise of state power, the illusion of modernity, and oppression through official architecture and art. Drawing from the logic of padugo, a local ritual that necessitates the sacrifice of animal blood to ensure the strong foundation and safe completion of buildings and bridges, and exploiting what is perhaps a semantic slippage of the collective imaginary in the urban legend that the San Juanico Bridge, at the First Lady's behest, had been sustained by the blood of street children whose bodies were either mixed with cement or thrown in the river below, depending on which version. And of course, its perverse real-life counterpart, the Manila Film Center tragedy, where over 100 workers were killed in the collapse resulting from the construction's frenzied pace to meet the First Lady's deadline, and where bodies are said to have also been buried under the cement. We turn to what Imelda Marcos has claimed to be, quote, our Parthenon built in a time of hardship, unquote, quote, the sanctuary of the Filipino soul and the monument of the Filipino spirit, unquote, and a testament to her slogan, truth, beauty, goodness, the CCP. Quote, this gift to the Filipino people, unquote, whose construction Imelda Marcos justified as, quote, for the development of the Filipino soul, unquote, since, quote, the spirit cannot be starved while we minister to the body, unquote, and whose inception is hence, quote, above legalities and beyond economic constraints, unquote, would turn out to have been founded in the lives of the victims of the couple's brutal regime, subsisting in part on the massive theft of public funds, widespread poverty, the famine in Negros and Muslim Mindanao, the estimated 3,257 who were killed, and the 40,000 tortured, among other tragedies. Fortified by blood, quote, to stand through time as a living tribute to a First Lady's indomitable spirit, unquote, the CCP as an edifice threatens to subsume and override the bodies of these individuals in its, quote, majestic structure, unquote. In the task of rearticulating these structures of oppressive architecture as buildings tainted with blood, the Padugo ritual can act as a potent and subversive analytic in reading the implications of power and desire and the many aspects of collaboration in the arts and culture during the traumatic period of the Marcos dictatorship, with the CCP at its center as a site of haunting, that is, an overdetermined and remnant space cast as an archive of spectral traces. The inauguration of the center in 1969 promised, quote, a new dawn in Philippine cultural history, unquote, that would usher an unprecedented flowering of the arts, with the First Lady of the land as its principal patroness. A new era that would also mark the threshold of massive plunder and abuse by the Marcoses. Even at present, the halls of the center remain venue to the indices of fervent delusion, the baroquely decadent extravagance that has characterized Imelda as an adjective, and the beginning of a series of unsustainable betting sprees that would swamp generations of Filipinos until 2025. The preserved and sustained physical constitution of the CCP, Locsin's architecture, for one, or the three magnificent chandeliers made of brass, over 20,000 capiz shells, and Viennese crystal prisms that, quote, secure an aura of elegance, unquote, and cost a total of approximately $10,000, restored last year with an approved budget of 1.7 million pesos. Or the photograph of the Marcoses during their glory days that still hung in the building, lays out and underlines even more the continuum between CCP's inception and the present. To this day, the details of the center's, quote, dazzling interiors, unquote, that lend easily to exclamations of awe and marvel, lavishly described in the center's initial press releases and public relations materials, remain intact, conjuring the unsettling here and now of martial law and the same center that has persisted through the fascist years from the time it was inaugurated. The octagonal pool that, quote, serenely mirrors the front of the cultural center's edifice, unquote, the giant German-built fountain of dancing waters, the main vault plastered with reinforced Romblon in Italian marble slabs, lush carpets, the grand stairway rising out of the polished marble floor, coffered ceilings covered with an antique gold foiled paper, the four interconnected pavilions and rooms, Manansala's powerful mural fashioned out of bronze, the main theater curtain designed after H.R. Ocampo's painting Genesis, the Kyoto woven tapestry in the Little Theater based on a painting by Chabet, and the gift shop, which still displays pictures and biographies of the former First Lady. Apart from its physical features, the center has also retained its logo from Marcos' time, emblematic, of course, of the institutional and bureaucratic trappings, however little, that must have persisted as well, along perhaps with the dregs of the former First Lady's vision. The acronym KKK, ironically styled after the Katipunan flag, expropriates an originally Platonic dictum to celebrate and enforce the opiating and anesthetizing potential of the arts during the couple's despotic reign. The logo's maxim had conveniently abstracted and eluded the material conditions under the new society, privileging instead the supposedly transcendent and divine facets of human life. This same logo is worn by the students of the Philippine High School for the Arts, an offshoot institution of its mothership, CCP. The school's profile on the PHSA's official website traces its beginnings to, quote, the young former President E. Marcos who yearned for a people born to greatness and envisioned a society worthy of the heritage of the Filipino people, unquote. And still cites the National Arts Center's formal dedication, quote, to the pursuit of the good, the true, and the beautiful, unquote. In the conference room hangs a group photo of the school personnel with Imelda Marcos in the middle of the front row, taken during her visit at the school several years ago. The problematic Filipinist discourse, characteristic of Imelda Marcos' program in its basic objective of Filipinization, that coaxed Filipino artists to articulate their decidedly Filipino identity, whatever that means, and uphold what is truly Filipino, still largely informs the PHSA's art curriculum. One of the center's publications during martial law stated that, quote, new works are commissioned yearly to encourage artists to experiment on native themes as basis for larger works of Philippine identity, unquote. Incidentally, Jerry Leonardo's Mibuyan-inspired giant Christmas tree at the CCP was launched in November last year. The aforementioned continuum culminates in 7 Arts, 1 Imelda, a, quote, lavish tribute, unquote, for the center's founding chair Imelda Marcos and her, quote, lifelong patronage of the 7 Arts, unquote. Staged by the CCP in celebration of the 40th anniversary of the center in 2009, on the 1992nd birth anniversary of Ferdinand Marcos. Staged at a cost of less than 1 million pesos because the artists performed for free, the, quote, Imelda Extravaganza, unquote, was spearheaded by acclaimed concert pianist, then CCP artistic director and now CCP President Raul Zunico, who he himself was one of the First Lady's beneficiaries during the Marcos years. This strictly by invitation only gala event featured 9 of the country's most talented musicians, all of whom received assistance from Imelda, and extolled the 7 Arts through signature pieces created during the period of Imelda's patronage. I was born shortly before martial law ended, and I do not have my own memories of the period. I can only vaguely remember a televised image I saw as a child of the dying former dictator in his exile in Hawaii. My parents grew up in Coron, Palawan, and martial law as related to us children were limited to stories about the time of curfews, rice sold with corn grit, and the ghost stubs the farmers in Coron and the rest of the country had accumulated for their supposed respective claims to the Coco Levy Fund. To quote Bing del Rosario, my parents were ordinary Filipinos whose everyday lives and inhabited spaces the, quote, atrocities only tangentially touched, unquote. Having grown up in the province and being a young and impressionable student at that time, I was predictably overcome with fascination the first time I set foot at the center. Back then, the edifice and its interior seemed so innocent, so removed from the brutal context of the fascist regime. My position now as someone working in the field of the humanities and as a teacher, where during a teaching stint at the PHSA, I encountered some student artists who have not even heard of the word desaparecido, or who, without batting an eye, would say yes to working for the Marcoses, has compelled me to look further into the implications and vicissitudes of the cultural center, which turns 50 a few years from now. I recently learned that my great-grandfather Enrique Jimeno Piedad's 1930s version of the Comedia Principe Baldovino, that he had staged over the years on the different islands of Calamianes during fiestas, was adapted by Rolando Tino, a regular theater director of the CCP during Mrs. Marcos' time, into a spectacular and contemporized costume drama in 1971 to inaugurate the CCP Little Theater, barely a year after Piedad's death. The discovery of my family's oblique connection to the former First Lady's Cultural Center during its early years has led me to problematize notions of innocence and inquire about the varied nuances and degrees of complicity in its subsequent paradoxes between agent and state towards the realization of work in the context of artistic and cultural production during the Marcos regime. Distinguished artists who have been key figures in realizing the First Lady's dream, national artist for music Lucrecia Casilag, CCP president for a decade from 1976 until Marcos' overthrow. Painters Roberto Chabet and Ray Albano, poet Alejandrino Fofana, and national artist architect Leandro Locsin. Those who were simply commissioned, such as writers Adrian Cristobal, Iliana Maramag, national artist Virgilio Almario, and Carmen Guerrero Nakpil. Composers, national artist Felipe Padilla de Leon, Lucio San Pedro, Levi Silerio, and George Canseco. The couturiers behind the Steel Butterfly, national artists Ramon Valera, Petoy Moreno, Ogie Cordero, Joe Salazar, and Ino Soto, and painters Malang and Serafin Serna. The signees of the Coalition of Writers and Artists for Freedom and Democracy, who include Teo Antonio, Ruth Mabanglo, Lamberto Antonio, S.V. Pistola, Manuel Baldemor, and Mike Bigornia. The consistent beneficiaries of Mrs. Marcos' patronage, among others, National Artist for Visual Arts Arturo Luz, and National Artist for Literature Orlando Tino, whose Teatro Pilipino was a resident company of the CCP in Imelda's time. And Tino himself enjoyed a close relationship with the former First Lady. Recipients of the former First Lady's assistants, who were practically children at the time and who to this day have kept more or less positive relations with the Marcoses, most notable of which were pianists Cecil Licad, Raul Sunico, Rowena Arrieta, and Jaime Bolipata, violinists Julian Kirit and Joseph Ismilla, cellist Ramon Bolipata, flutist Antonio Maige, and singer Lea Salonga. The national artists appointed by Ferdinand Marcos, all other artists who in one way or another have been instrumental to the Marcos propaganda machine. How does one measure the extent of complicity, and to what degree can the artist be held accountable? If the halls of the center had been tainted with blood, who among these favored artists then have blood on their hands, so to speak, especially since their counterparts on the other side of the field, who had chosen to speak against, resist, or fight, were silenced, tortured, or destroyed? How does one appraise Carmen Guerrero Nakpil, who claims to have collaborated with the Marcoses for survival and who, despite her closeness to the Marcoses, was one of the very few that never made money? Nakpil recounts that she worked for the Marcoses in exchange for the freedom of her daughter and son-in-law, who were then allied with the left. She was on the arrest list years after martial law was declared, but Nakpil got it from the former First Lady that the latter vouched for her and her name was removed from the list. Furthermore, what do we make of former PHSA scholar and renowned visual artist Leroy New, who was commissioned by Governor Jaime Marcos in 2012 and 2014 to build giant avant-garde installations that now comprise the Art Installation Park on the Paway Sand Dunes, facilitating the creation of Marcos-sponsored spectacles for the people during the governor's province-wide La Virgen Milagrosa Festival? Where do we draw the line between Marcos and LGU sponsorship? How does one set about the artist's complicity in the context of public commission work? In this case, a project of the Ilocos Norte provincial government that was supposedly for the people, in contrast to private commissions. Bringing art to the community and utilizing local materials and labor, Governor Marcos, according to New, claimed that this project was for regional development. At the groundbreaking ceremonies in 1973 for the now close to stagnant and seemingly phantom satellite of the CCP, the National Arts Center, a 13.5 hectare art-oriented Shangri-La, quote-unquote, art-oriented Shangri-La, on Mount Makiling, the First Lady's message delusively cited its realization as an, quote, embarking upon the end of alienation between the artist and his society, unquote. In another occasion, however, Mrs. Marcos iterated that, quote, culture and the arts are hardly political, unquote. With her motto, katotohanan, kagandahan, kabutihan, she perversely sought a corrupted sense of apotheosis and the sublime that limited the arts to, quote, enjoyment, appreciation, and pleasure, unquote, and at best to, quote, the things of the heart and the longings of the spirit, unquote, that were anomalously removed from social realities. The heart The same principles resonate in the people who have worked for or benefited from the Marcoses during and after martial law, underlining further the traces of the period that persist in the present order. Then CCP President Jaime Sobel de Ayala defended the CCP's commitment to art and art alone. It shall not be subservient to any ideological belief. He insisted that the artist's creation is not a product of the dictate of his creed or political affiliation or ideological belief. Art's only commitment is to truth and beauty. Similarly, Purita Kalaw Ledesma has intoned that artists should be united in a common endeavor, which is the expression of beauty. In his defense of the stand taken by the Coalition of Writers and Artists for Freedom and Democracy in 1986, Virgilio Almario asked, excuse me, ano ngayon ang masama kung ang isang Makata ay pumani kay Marcos? Perhaps failing to grasp the relationship between an artist's integrity and its praxis, he finds no contradiction in serving Marcos and aspiring to pursue and develop nationalist concerns in literature. Dahil ba sa naging tauhan ako ni Marcos ay wala na akong karapatang magpanukala ng landasing nasyonalista para sa panitikan? Parang hindi kayo nagkakamali, hindi kayo marunong tumawa. In view of criticisms regarding Leandro V. Locsin's hand in the propaganda and myth-making by way of state-sponsored edifices, Andy Locsin confidently shared that his father had been possessed of the knowledge that he undertook Marcos' commissions fully in good faith and mindful of the integrity of his delivery as a professional. Ryan Cayabyab, who he himself was a product of Marcos-founded Metropop, has acknowledged that martial law was a time of fear and division, and that some who went underground died and those who survived now narrate tales of torture. At the time of Seven Arts Juan Imelda, however, Cayabyab served as a musical director and the composer of the tribute's main theme. Suggestively nostalgic for the years that well coincide with the height of Mrs. Marcos' patronage of the arts under the dictatorship, the song aims to quote, capture the spirit of an age and the distinct sensibility of a woman who has shaped so much of our culture, unquote, and cites Imelda Marcos as, quote, our muse, unquote, whose dreams led us to tragic, tender, / vision, splendor, / all because she dreamed we could. These are lines from the song. Also along these lines, prima ballerina Lisa Macuja Elizalde, wife and daughter-in-law to Marcos cronies Fred J. Elizalde, and Panamin head and plunderer Manuel Elizalde, respectively, and one of the artists who also performed for free at the CCP's gala tribute to Imelda Marcos, staged her comeback last year with Rebel, in time for the 30th anniversary of the EDSA Revolution. In this full-length ballet that recounted the tyranny of the Marcoses and, quote, celebrated the spirit of people power, unquote, Macuja Elizalde played the role of Inang Bayan. Let art and politics be separate, Sunico announced in his welcome remarks at Seven Arts Juan Imelda. To criticisms heaped at the same event, the CCP Board of Trustees remarked, we have always been committed to the propagation of the Filipino arts and culture and to keeping politics at bay as fiercely as we can. Lea Salonga, when asked about her stand on the Marcoses, waxed nostalgia over the time presentations were held at the palace, when, quote, every presentation showed how beautiful our fashions were and how talented our artists were, unquote. And when, quote, Bayanihan danced our folk dances, Petoy Moreno showed his wares, and Lea Salonga sang, unquote. She also insisted that, to be fair, to sing at the palace is always an honor, regardless of who's sitting. Accused to have benefited from the Coco Levy Fund scam, artist and cultural worker Clara Lebregat Balaguer, progeny to Maria Clara Lebregat, who was directly involved in the scandal, snapped at her critics on Facebook that she's not legally implicated and that her grandmother was long dead, and that her family's actions and political views have nothing to do with her. What do we make of virtuosity, especially since a number of these artists, and especially given our trying context as a quote-unquote developing nation, owe the apex of their careers to the slew of commission work or a patronage of some kind? What do we now make of these statements if and since art can never be sheer form and mastery of the craft, and politics can never be possibly kept at bay? The artist's person cannot be divorced from its art. Form cannot be wrestled away from ideology. Artistic practice from moral integrity. And ethics and aesthetics should remain inextricable from each other. And lastly, where does one fit Gawad Manilikha ng Bayan awardee Magdalena Gamayo in all this? And how does her example further complicate the said issues pertaining to collaboration? In anticipation of the late dictator's imminent burial, 93-year-old Gamayo, together with Inabel Weavers in Pinili, Ilocos Norte, has lovingly and painstakingly prepared with pride a special death shroud for Ferdinand Marcos as her utmost gift and pabaon in what appears to be the culmination of her life work. That we can speak in these dark times means that we have been spared. We remain unscathed and intact. That our capacity to be lucid and articulate entails a privileged position marked by our distance from the trauma, and that the least we can do is overcome ignorance and respond. In the absence of monuments and testaments to the atrocities in the wake of the Marcos rule, and the persistence of the same crimes to this day, it is our task as writers, cultural workers, and educators to propose and negotiate critical and ethical means of reading and writing the past, generate memorials and elegies that facilitate in historical inquiry and upkeep of social justice, and engage in technologies for conjuring and reinscribing what have been effaced or written out to accord the disappeared the rightful place in history. Taking after the line, "Lend me your softness," which puts forward the erotics of negotiation, expropriation, and surrender. This research will also explore the various registers of softness in the processes of collaboration, adaptation, translation, correspondence, and conversion in the hybrid context of the Philippine Comedia, by taking off on my great-grandfather Enrique Jimeno Piedad's Principe Baldovino from Coron Island in Palawan. The project will be comprised of inquiries into the inflections and extracts that intimate labors of worlding and spectacle from the following materials across time periods and milieus: metrical romances from the Charlemagne cycle of the medieval planet, the 16th century Spanish Comedia introduced in Hispanic Philippines a century later through the galleon trade, faraway and marvelous imaginary kingdoms in the subsequently hybridized comedias, script of Piedad's aforementioned 1930s version of the Charlemagne epic that he has also staged over the years on the different islands of the Calamianes group of islands during fiestas. The script, there's no existing manuscript, but of the original script, but Tino has emphasized in a number of interviews that he never altered a word in his adaptation. It's more of how he designed. It's more on how he intervened with the cosmetic aspects of the performance. The CCP library has a copy of a sound recording of the entire performance. Father Horacio de la Costa's invocation of at the blessing of the Cultural Center of the Philippines, and Imelda Marcos' speech during the same inauguration in 1969, with the ambition of ushering the presumed golden age of the arts in the Philippines through her patronage. At the threshold of, and the audio documentation of national artist Rolando Tino's contemporarized adaptation of Principe Baldovino, whose script he learned from scholar and critic Doreen Fernandez during her research on folk drama from the 19th to early 20th centuries in an effort to turn back to vernacular theater and rediscover the tradition that had been banished to the provinces. So there, theater historian Doreen Fernandez, who discovered the script among Piedad's papers on a research trip as a graduate student shortly after Piedad's death, has twice cited the text in her inquiries into the appropriative deviations of Comedia, which includes a psychological realism that is inward rather than outward, a privileging of character, and in Chongson's words, an indigenization of motivation, from its old European source text to dispel accusations of sheer mimicry or the complicit reproduction of colonial Christian orders. The 1971 adaptation by Tino has also been cited in several other sources as a marker of the vernacular shift in the 70s in the pursuit of a national theater that culled from the so-called regions and ran parallel to the then First Lady's nationalist art programs and the CCP's manifesto, in addition to the adaptation's demonstration of the concurrent cosmopolitanist direction of traditional drama, which also started around the same period. Vicente Rafael claims that staging comedias meant, among other things, bringing both spatial and temporal distances up close. The unknown regions of the Western past now suddenly became accessible to native audiences. Furthermore, transposed from the traditional context of a village fiesta into a modern performance space in the national capital as a spectacular costume drama to institute the new experimental theater, or contextualized from its insular and make-do stagings in Palawan to its cosmopolitanized dramaturgy at the bourgeois setting of the CCP, which stands on some 28 hectares reclaimed from Manila Bay. Piedad's Principe Baldovino also invites one to look into notions of softness and the transpositions and permutations between the medieval world and colonial Philippines, between Comedia, letter C, and Comedia, letter K, between the colonial and the indigenous, the quote-unquote folk and the so-called contemporary, the so-called vernacular, and the national and the cosmopolitan. The physical space of the insular, that is Calamianes, and of that of the coastal CCP, in the national capital. And the elsewhere of Comedia's fabled kingdoms and forests situated in Europe or the Americas, Africa, the Middle East or Southeast Asia, and kingdoms and forests situated in Europe or the Americas, Africa, and the varied local, that is, sites or venues of translation and performance. Rendering comedias as, quote, amalgamations of various motifs, characters, and geographical settings, unquote, and, quote, moving the geography beyond the stage, it is a historical spectacle that makes the journey to multiple sites possible, unquote. Other than being a Comedia practitioner who also designed and created makeshift costumes and props for his productions, Piedad had a naive penchant for assemblage art. My examination of his performance text opens up significant points relating to yielding or wielding softness in the context of translation in language and medium, and the assemblage as model and process. In the course of collaborating with his work and with other texts prompted by association, in order to come up with this research, and employing his fixation with the assemblage, I seek to lay out a continuum of artistic production and desire between Piedad and myself across personal, familial, and state histories, generating points throughout my work through borrowed and appropriated objects found within the timeline between and beyond us. Thus, my output becomes a genealogical gesture that also recasts the line "Lend me your softness" as an invocation to Piedad, who was simply known to the family as a rake and rascal. Far from the artist in person, I have only very recently encountered in the archives, and the language, nuances, and probable meanings of his sole surviving work. In this project, I also wish to trace the tender and erotic but potentially endangering imperative, lend me your softness, and the quote, romantic entanglement of the Muslim prince with the Christian princess, unquote, or vice versa, that characterizes the Comedia, in part as a traditional form. The Comedia almost always culminates in surrender, conquest, and amorous union, but still invokes a non-communitarian post-identity politics of overlapping interests and heterogeneous or hybrid images of the space in order to challenge notions of belonging, identity, citizenship, and even territory. This is a passage from Scholar Theatrical. In the final scene in Tina's adaptation, quote, the Moro prince being baptized retains his Moro signification through his costume. Although the baptism or conversion suggests that difference is dissolved so that the prince can fit in the Christian world, the scene also foregrounds a state of submission and embrace that does not disavow the quality of strangeness that must even shadow familiarity, unquote. The kings and queens, caliphs and sultans, princes and princesses interact in combinations of love and war that bring about victories for the Christians and conversions of the Moros. This is an observation by Doreen Fernandez. A sensual play of power, resistance, and submission in this violent and passionate tug between the two kingdoms and cultures, in which the desirability and threat of the adversarial other becomes manifest in their intimately dangerous encounter, vulnerating the now delicate barrier between the self and other. My research also aims to examine softness along the following lines: the devotional motivation and the suitability of lengthy dancing as an offering to a patron saint, the place of Comedia in such debatable discourses as the meaningful responsibilities in the period of developing a national memory, and in the softness or negotiation that is the continuing process of nation building. Complicity between artist and state towards the realization of work, adaptation and appropriation as modes of historiography, or ensuing fictions and false documents of these artistic processes as negotiated histories, heredity, and softness as eros, or simply the place of desire in all this. As an adaptation of various world theaters, composites of various metrical romances and their prior translations, and translations of translations for which literally no original existed. This is from Vince Raphael. The Comedia bears the increments of hybridization over the centuries, and this softness remains felt in its, quote, a historical presence, unquote, as hospitality and openness, marked by the improvisational quality of performances and its generosity and hospitality and its openness to many sources, not to mention how its performance opens up the town to strangers during fiestas. The Comedia, as a series of borrowings from and negotiations among various forces, in itself lends much to the project of exploring the multivalence of softness in the collaborative context. Hence, I deem the Comedia productive as an analytic, or perhaps a rhetorical model, a critical model for, again, finding a way around a seeming deadlock, no? Doon nga sa paradox ng complicity. Um, during martial law, siguro mas urgent noon, no? Since mas malakas na yung patronage ng state. Pero I suppose in the present order, mainam na rin mag-ramify yung study dun sa mga private na institutions. Yung collaboration ng artist, no, with private institutions. Yeah, I deem the Comedia productive as an analytic in reading the implications of power and desire between and among fictive Moors and Christians, colonizer and indigene, folk and contemporary artists, Piedad, Tino and myself, cultural workers and the Marcoses, island folk and culturati, Piedad and his progeny, my parents, my mother and I, myself and you, dear listener, spectator, other, lover, beloved. Relations in which even the very binaries and categories that enable our eros and identities in these encounters are rendered soft. Thank you. Yeah, so ayun, if in case na it seems that the second part is kind of off tangent from the from the bigger context of the history of the CCP and the Marcoses. Yun nga, so, I think what Principe Baldovino and the nature of Comedia uh, demonstrate, hindi talaga black and white. No? If you would notice, there are barely answers in the paper. No? Mas madaming, there's a slew of questions that I hope we could discuss. No? I hope we could um, let us know as well what we think, no? Uh, mga probable answers to this slew of questions. So, yun nga, it's very paradoxical and it's never black and white. No? It can never really essentialize. You can never really be purist about it, no? So I think that's what the Comedia, in even its adaptation, demonstrate, no? And that's why I think it's a productive critical model in finding a way around this. So, salamat. Yay. Yeah, sorry that was a mouthful.
Do you have any questions for Mr. Tablazon? Ito yung mic.
Percent, were you able to get the answer or comments? Bakit principle would be wala or CCP sa bakit principle would be anong meron sa narrative?
Hindi tungkol dun, hindi specific sa narrative, no? Pero um, kasama sa programa nung early years ng CCP, no? Kasama sa programa nung nila na nabanggit ko dito kanina, no? Merong shift back to the so-called regions. So, magkakaroon ng serye si Rolando Tino ng mga i-adapt na mga so-called folk plays, no? Galing sa mga probinsya. At ang pinakauna doon ay yung Principe Baldovino galing sa Coron, Palawan. Pero ang pinaka ano talaga, pinaka parang key person dito ay si Doreen Fernandez. Medyo serendipitous yun. Siya yung nakahanap nung nagkataon na nagtitesis siya noon under Nick Chongson. And during a trip in Coron, may nakapagturo sa kanya na may Comedia practitioner dun sa lugar, pinuntahan niya, patay na, kinuha niya yung mga dokumento. And that coincided with the CCP. I think it was also Tino's initiative, no, to kind of parang regress. That was sort of his term, no, yung to return to the there's a vernacular shift nung panahon na yon na I suppose pang balance dun sa internationalism. And he enjoyed the kind of intervention na i-revive niya, gagawin niyang there were numerous articles that referenced his adaptation as a spectacular Shakespearean costume drama. So ginawa niya yun without again altering, changing any word sa original na script, no? So Yeah, basically that's it. It's not specific to the narrative. Since it's comedy, it's very formulaic. No? It's not specific to the narrative. Pero mas andun dun sa may ganong ideology at that time, no? That they need to, parang, yung ginagawa siguro ngayon, ano, merong the new black, you know, the regional is the new black, no? So, nagkaroon ng ganong spark at that time. Particularly sa theater arts.
More questions?
Ay, salamat.
No more, no more.
Ano sa tingin niyo yung mga tanong? Hindi ko rin alam ang sagot eh. Okay lang ba yon? Okay lang ba? Sa mga artists dito. Go lang. Okay lang tumanggap ng commissions. Yeah, I think the most ironic thing is, and this is especially true um, for Philippine cinema during the Marcos years. Actually, Joel David wrote, I'm not sure if it's a book or, yeah, he wrote a book, yung A Week in the Dark. A Week in, yung paradox nga ng um, paradox na yung nag-thrive yung pelikulang Pilipino, no? Kung kailan martial law. And yeah, yung si Chabet lang, 'di ba? Hanggang ngayon yung legacy niya talagang prominent. And he's one of the beneficiaries. So yeah, I'm not sure if it's really possible to draw a fine line, ano.
Off the hook na ba si Christian? Maybe this can be resolved with beer.
Okay.
Alright. Thank you, Christian Tablazon.
Salamat, maraming salamat po. Magandang gabi.
Pero may mga tanong pa sila.
Oo nga eh.
Maybe ano.
Salamat.
Nakilala mo si Pang? Dapat stronger ba dapat yan? Basta. Ano ba siya dumating? Uy,
Basta may pasin siya.
okay. Ay, are you ano?